Video game discourse is broken. There we go. I can't be accused of burying the lead on this one. How we talk about video games as a creative medium is damaged, and a lot of it comes down to who is talking about games, who their audiences are, how they talk about them, and how little each side connects with one another, from the developers who make them to the players that play them, and everyone in the middle, the publishers, influencers, PR companies, journalists, and more. It's a breakdown in communication, as language and understanding of games is not shared, and it leads to our current situation where misinformation is rife. The vast majority of people who play games have absolutely no idea how they are made, and it's a barrier that not only emerged as a byproduct of the industry's origins, but is maintained and reinforced by some to manufacture hype or outrage, and sadly, a lot of people buy into it. I'm Tommy Thompson, and in this Design Dive episode, I want to talk about this issue, where the points of failure lie and how we could resolve it. Let me stress before I begin that I don't want to paint everyone as being at fault here. There are many individuals and companies doing great work in development, production, education, PR, community management, journalism, and more that highlights how we can build a stronger, more inclusive, more informed, and more aspirational games industry. And the key to all of this is better mechanisms through which to support and encourage the audience's curiosity about how games are made. Making video games is difficult. It's a process that is as liberating and exciting as it can be stressful and demoralising. But games, like all art, are never finished, they're abandoned. And once released, they're at the mercy of the wider world as they seek an audience who respect their vision and can appreciate them for what they are. This is a notion that sits on my mind a lot. I play a lot of video games. I study them as a scholar and researcher. I make my own games. I make other people's games. I've spent years teaching students how to make games, and of course, spend a lot of time on YouTube with yourselves, communicating the inner workings of games to an audience that, for the most part, does not share my background and expertise. My goal is to enable for my audience to appreciate the hard work that goes into making a game, and to learn a little more about the technical challenges faced, even for games that you might have little interest in playing. I get asked frequently whether my work impacts my ability to enjoy games, and if anything, it kinda does the opposite. It enriches my appreciation of what a game tries to do. It's why I never express an opinion on the games I'm covering on AI in Games. Even if I don't particularly like a game I've covered, and some of them I actively dislike, I still respect the work that goes into making them happen. Plus, for many of my viewers, a game I cover on the show may well be one that you adore, and it defeats the purpose of my videos trying to educate viewers if I drag my personal feelings into it. And the same applies even if I do like the game, although sometimes that enthusiasm is a little harder to hide. But it's from this detached perspective that I worry, because the discourse around games has always leaned towards consumerism. Of buying games, owning games, and now streaming games, and recording the playing of games and what it means for the player to play the game. Now, yes, games are an interactive medium, but in more passive mediums, such as music, art, literature, and film, we think more about what the creators sought to evoke in their audience. But here, while there is a lot of well-meaning and wonderful critique of gaming culture, much of games discourse breeds a sense of entitlement by virtue of ownership, even though what you own and all you have ever owned is essentially a license to consume the content in a specific manner. It's what leads to this bizarre quest for validation in pre-ordering products that nobody has yet played, because the end consumer has a heightened sense of their purpose in what is ultimately a capitalist transaction. And it's a problem that's rooted in the games industry, in that given it is technically complex and has only become more complex over time, it has actively avoided engaging with players about the realities of how games are made. And now it's metastasized to a point that the so-called gamer audience harbour mistrust towards the very people who create the things they so desperately want to love. Consumerist culture begets a moral degradation, where corners of the games industry push their products on their most avid of audiences, while any and all integrity from both sides may well begin to erode. A strategy of turning customers into fans of something they don't even own, guaranteeing whatever cash they can from them. And once the money is exchanged, they later hope to absolve themselves of the responsibilities of handling the audiences they have cultivated. All the while, journalists and game developers ultimately suffer the consequences. Supposed fans are adamant that the game that they have not yet played is better than a journalist who has actually played the game has made it out to be. Meanwhile, any effort by developers to actively engage with players often becomes a carefully managed discussion. Not because they don't want to talk about their games, I have many videos on this channel that prove otherwise, but because players have such broken, ill-informed ideas about how games are made that any statement released publicly will receive a massive amount of scrutiny. Now, while this video was conceived during the fallout of the Cyberpunk 2077 release, it's really a comment on the state of games discourse as it has developed in the past 30 years, as games have become increasingly closed off and difficult to learn about as their complexity has skyrocketed. Game development is one of the most obfuscated creative processes out there. Yes, there are hurdles of technology that must be overcome, but it's also a process that is not often communicated outside of the industry itself. Now, one issue here is that many of the challenges faced by developers only really make sense if you've witnessed or experienced it firsthand. Now, I haven't shipped a AAA game, but I've worked on smaller titles and even shipped my own work. I have a lot of respect for even the smallest of development teams who ship their games to a storefront for sale. People are often quick to deride the latest Call of Duty or Ubisoft open world game, given the development team numbers in the hundreds if not thousands, but that's an additional layer of complexity that requires good production pipelines and communication so that it all comes together, especially in the past year or so, as the coronavirus moved a lot of work to being remote and at home. And any game, from the biggest AAA studio to the solo indie dev, suffers the same issue I've mentioned already. They're never really finished, they're abandoned. It's just that some are abandoned in a better state than others. It's incredibly rare that a game ships with everything originally intended, or even looks like or contains the same content as it did when it was first shown to potential customers. The art style will change, the UI will get rebuilt several times over, core systems will become even more clunky and broken as the game transitions through development phases, concessions are made between simple, buggier code or rewriting entire systems in the weeks prior to launch. Hours are lost iterating on design or gameplay features based on feedback that contradicts itself. Meanwhile, entire days are dedicated to debugging that one edge case that feels impossible to reproduce but is breaking entire sets of mechanics or content. And all of this leads to development crunch in the closing weeks, as developers work overtime either to hit the date for Gold Master or the day one patch at launch. How I teach games development has changed after every game I've worked on. I imagine many game developers listening to this now are in a similar position, that how they view games changes drastically as a result of their experiences. Now, I'm not saying I understand game dev entirely, and even then I'd argue most developers don't, but having that experience reframes what I think is important in how we communicate and discuss games, and how we impart knowledge to others who want to work in this industry or even just want to enjoy the fruits of its labour. And none of this is to say there isn't an enthusiasm or a desire to communicate outside of developer circles, but the issue is that it can be difficult and time-consuming to make that work effectively. From my time interviewing developers, the consensus I've formed is that, for the most part, they love opportunities to talk about their work, but one of the reasons developers are happy to talk to me is they're confident that I understand enough of the realities of development that we can come to a mutual understanding. We discuss technical details that could never appear in a regular interview, and with this comes a trust and responsibility on my part to deliver that information to you all. My episodes on Sea of Thieves, Division 2, Watch Dogs Legion, Spec Ops The Line, Doom 2016, Halo Wars 2, BPM bullets per minute, and more benefit from this approach and rely on a confidence that what is told to me won't be misconstrued or taken out of context. All of this requires people to be fluent in game development practices, and for the most part, access to valid information on how game development works is limited but has improved in recent years. Because until recently, there were very few avenues through which hobbyists or amateurs could actually learn. Only in the last 10 years or so has a college or university degree in game development been a viable path into the industry. Speaking from my own experience, game development courses struggle with finding staff and resource that would deliver a useful and pragmatic education, and heck, sometimes they just don't bother, given it's easier to fleece students of tuition money and make it up as you go. Meanwhile, the democratization and success of engines such as Unity and Unreal does help students and hobbyists better understand how things are done, but there is still a need for expertise to come out of the industry and into the wider world to show how best to utilize these tools. Game developer conferences that run throughout the year are good examples of this, but talks at developer conferences or meetups are aimed at other developers. These are often fantastic events for people in the industry, hence it's often difficult to consider these of value to anyone outside of it. Plus, it can be difficult to create an event of that scale that would broaden the audience. These events are often expensive to organise and put together, and I've helped coordinate and attended several that barely broke even despite help from corporate sponsorship. They can then in turn be expensive to attend and have little public presence, not to mention all of the issues with visas and access to the country that it's running in. So if you can't attend or don't pay for the talk recordings, you're never going to find out what was said. To put this in context, AI in games exists because I wanted to create a conduit for people to understand how AI impacts games that was aimed at a broader audience. And a good example of the issues I just raised is that this channel is largely famous for my first Alien Isolation video, which is based on a talk my Andy Bray delivered at the Nuclei conference. I attended that conference because I helped organise one of the tracks in it, and was in the audience for the talk itself. Now, that talk has never been repeated, and while it was recorded, the conference it was held at no longer exists. So for many, my videos are the sole mechanism to learn about the workings of this game. Or in the case of What Culture, steal what I presented and use it to prop up half of their top 20 facts video. Now you might think, oh Tommy, that's a bit unfair, they credit the presentation that you also referred to. I mean, they explain AI related points in a manner all too similar to my video, which isn't grounds for an accusation, but the smoking gun is fact number 2 in their video, that the xenomorph has eyes in the back of its head. That isn't from the talk. That fact emerged from a discussion I had with some of the game's developers over coffee afterwards, so as far as the world is concerned, those facts are only out there because I shared them. So yeah, What Culture? Cite your actual sources, you bunch of thieving. But conferences only work if companies are willing to share any insight into their creative process, and that's seldom an issue driven by developers. While language barriers can be an issue, the real challenge can come from cultures driven by management at either the studio or publisher level, where the inner workings of a game are kept secret to suit their purposes. The recent story surrounding the patent for the Nemesis system in Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War is a fantastic example of this. Developers Monolith have never gone into 100% detail on how it works, because as far as their parent company Warner Bros. Interactive are concerned, there is no incentive to share how it works, given they want to keep it close to their chest and protect it, courtesy of their patent. However, no studio epitomizes this better than Rockstar. As succinctly expressed in the closing lines of a 2018 interview with GQ magazine, Dan Houser, Red Dead Redemption 2's writer and executive producer, had this to say about why the studio works under a shroud of secrecy. "Sam and I talk about this a lot," he replied, "and it's that games are still magical. It's like they're made by elves. You turn on the screen and it's just this world that exists on TV. I think you gain something by not knowing how they're made. As much as we might lose something in terms of people's respect for what we do, their enjoyment of what we do is enhanced, which is probably more important." And I think that is one of the biggest issues any aspiring developer or enthusiastic fan will ever come across. By hiding the realities of development and focusing on the needs of the consumer, it blinds people to the years spent making this game happen by a very large number of people, and often under difficult conditions. By referring to them as elves and the production as magical, it dehumanizes the entire process. It makes it easier for marketing at a publisher level to deliver slick, albeit simplified messages. It also makes it easier, subsequently, to diminish the contribution and value of individual developers and what they brought to the project. One of the biggest impacts to the home release market for films and television came with DVDs and later Blu-rays. Studios release new titles or re-release older ones in increasingly higher resolutions, but they also bundle in all sorts of special features as a bonus to the consumer. Director commentaries, behind-the-scenes interviews, featurettes on visual effects or the soundtrack, showing how these elements take shape. Deleted scenes that show parts of a project that were thrown out because they didn't fit. Heck, even gag reels show that mistakes arise during filming, and don't require any further contextual knowledge to appreciate. It embraces the idea that the main feature on the disc is the product of a complicated and long-form collaborative and technical process. And it's not the only art form that does it. You have documentaries on musicians and their albums or tours, interviews with authors, painters, and comic book artists that go deep into their creative process. But for games, bundling this type of content in is something of an oddity. You don't see many documentaries on the making of games or developer resources in the game as something for players to enjoy. It's one of the few mediums that actively avoids talking about how the milk is made. Almost all publisher-level marketing is designed to be sleek and simple. We get trailers, extended gameplay sequences that are carefully manufactured, occasionally the odd featurette comprised of talking heads, talking in generic platitudes that provide little substance. Given the average player is so far removed from the reality of games development, and new titles continue to be marketed with mystery and magic, I'd argue that acknowledging the challenges of development publicly is almost impossible. If a game has gone through a difficult phase in production, It is now considered a failure of the creative process, rather than a tacit acknowledgement that that's just how these things often pan out. I'm not saying that every game needs to be marketed as such, nor does all of its dirty laundry need to be laid bare, but giving an insight into that development process can educate and reward the most avid of fans of a studio or franchise. Now you may well ask, does this not lead to more toxic behaviour? In some cases, yes. Assholes are assholes and you can't get around that. But educating your audience helps mitigate against misinformation, and it's in this area between the publisher and the player that misinformation becomes rife and our issues really lie. And while one can easily point to subreddits or influencers as the source, a lot of it is sown by the limited information publishers release to press and the promotional material that is not representative of the final product. This can be seen in the vast majority of announcement trailers and big press reveals. Pre-rendered trailers looking to excite players with this slick and polished cinematic at a time when the game itself is still years away from completion and might not have even gone into full production. Meanwhile, demos at E3 and Gamescom that are carefully constructed productions designed to showcase what the final game will be like, but they're often built exclusively for that event and are not being played with the person on stage holding the controller, and are in no way a reflection of the current state of development. It's like being shown real estate photos of a gorgeous looking kitchen, while the rest of the house is half built, and for some reason, known only to the construction team, it's actually on fire. In each case, it paints a picture of the idea behind the game rather than what it actually is. But the fact is that it's sold as what the game will be, and it means that the expectations of players are set up so early that when they don't align when the game comes out, there is naturally pushback. And it's a culture of the industry to always be seen to be working on something such that it bumps up shares for investors, but it ultimately does more harm than good for both developers and players. Some companies, notably Nintendo, do what I think is a much smarter approach in keeping quiet about a game until maybe 3 months prior to its release. Others will announce a game 4, 5, 6 years before it eventually comes out. And this puts developers in an awkward position, because now these trailers and fake demos have established what the game is, and now they need to deliver it. And again, game development is difficult, and it might be the case that it never actually lines up as planned, for both good or ill. Plus, there are situations where they simply don't want to share in advance what they're doing because they want to limit the blowback, especially in recent years with monetization models. I already voiced my disdain and concern about loot boxes and similar economies in a previous Design Dive episode. The gap between the publisher and the player is vast and the information is sparing, and it's in this space you have not just the gaming press, but the influencers and pundits all making noise and driving the narrative. And this is where the issues I've raised come manifest, either because fans drive narratives that suit their own needs, or journalists are trapped between doing right by their audience and playing by the rules. It's fair to say the gaming press has gone through a gradual and sometimes painful process over the last 20 years or so, transitioning towards cultural critique of games, which I think is great, especially as the number of unique genres and communities have grown, but also as it broadened its horizons from merely pundits talking about games to more savvy journalism. It can talk more about industry issues and thorny subjects. Sadly, for the most part, the non-specialist press has yet to really evolve, with recent gaming headlines offering the same outdated rhetoric of video games as toys and dangerous for children, which only buys into the existing simplified discourse on games. But games journalism that reports on new and upcoming releases is often at the mercy of the arrangements with the PR team attached to the game. PR dictates what access press will have, when copies of the game are available prior to launch, what platforms those are going to be available on, and when, where, and how information can be released. Now, while they have the power in this dynamic, I do wish to stress it's often not malicious, and in my experience, folks in PR are quite often absolutely lovely people who are simply in charge of executing decisions made higher up. Now, these PR interactions are typically covered by embargoes, or for things like preview sessions or review copies, a set of rules on the things you can and cannot say at a given point in time, and the time frame within which the things you can say can be published. A lot of this isn't built to be legally binding, and often embargoes make a lot of sense. Don't spoil major plot points or the ending of a big AAA game, that sort of thing. You want to maintain the hype right up to release, but there's an expectation you and your editorial play ball and stick to the rules, otherwise you risk being blacklisted. And in the worst case, although this is quite rare, there are non-disclosure agreements, legal documents that hold the journalist liable if information gets out that is not intended at the time it does, which can result in legal action. On one hand, this can sound quite draconian or aggressive, but for the most part it's not, and it just makes sense. I have a stack of NDAs and embargoes from working with studios and companies and from conducting interviews. While I advocate for greater transparency, this doesn't mean that you want all of that business information out in the open. You want to make sure that key information is released at appropriate times. But the issues that emerge are when the rules established are exploited to limit information, especially in the build-up to release. Press can find themselves in a delicate position, and sometimes that balance can be abused. It's increasingly common for games to try and circumvent the review cycle, advocating directly to their customers or via influencers. Bethesda does not release copies in advance to press, while others give limited windows before release with specific embargoes. Certain versions of a game might not be available, meaning that a cross-platform game is being assessed by potentially only one platform. For Cyberpunk, CD Projekt provided B-roll footage to use in videos rather than allowing press their own captures. Meanwhile, Activision frequently avoid adding monetization systems until after the release cycle. They don't want the fans caught up in the hype to stop and question their decision to buy the game, or for the disdain for these systems to tarnish the Metacritic scores. And this adds pressure to journalists given reviews and entertainment rely heavily on being on time. The slick marketing has brought the hype to fever pitch. You want to direct the clicks your way, but also you want to service your audience and do right by them. But in the case of a lot of AAA releases, journalists are playing prior to the big patch that is released as the game launches, so their experience is going to be different and often buggy. But quite often there's good faith here, when PR tells them the day one patch is going to address most of these issues. So for the reviewer, they're often playing a game that won't line up exactly with the experience players will have mere hours later when the patch drops. Sometimes that difference is minor, but in cases it can be quite drastic. And this brings on two situations where reviews clash with the fans. The review comes out, and the impression is it doesn't really line up with the hype. This might be because a critic doesn't like the game, and they're well within their right to qualify that opinion. Or the second issue, what if the review you published is based on good faith that the launch patch is going to fix the issues, and it does not? Ultimately, developers and the press are all being pushed harder and harder into compromising timeframes to deliver against a deadline, resulting not just in unsustainable and frankly unsavoury work practices, but setting people up for failure should it all go wrong. And of course, when it does go wrong, the audience blame the journalists and the developers for the situation. This is compounded by influencers and YouTubers, who can capitalise on a lot of this to reinforce their own narratives. Now, I'm not going to put any and all YouTube channels or Twitch streamers in this category, but the worst parts are when pundits theorise about stuff they don't know anything about, using their personality to drive engagement, views, and ultimately reinforce their ideologies. Now, when this is working well for a publisher, they latch onto it. Influencers are a great mechanism to circumvent the press cycle, but it also works the other way. When a game is in the news for all of the wrong reasons, or when rumours and misinformation spread, audiences flock towards it, and it's all thanks to confirmation bias. If you're not familiar, confirmation bias is a psychological behaviour where people prefer information that confirms or supports their beliefs on a given topic. So if you harbour a particular feeling or sentiment, you're more inclined to read articles, watch videos, and listen to podcasts that support that. Putting it in context of this channel, people watch my video on Alien Isolation because they're already convinced it's a great game or that the alien is a really clever AI. All I'm doing, in exchange for your views, is confirming your beliefs with a nicely presented set of facts and information. And this is common of even what I consider the best of YouTube's gaming channels. But this is something every content creator exploits to gather an audience. For every content creator presenting good and balanced presentations on upcoming games or the work surrounding them, you have others stoking anger or promoting narratives or outright conspiracies as means to bang their own drum. This lack of knowledge and insight is weaponized, and on the flip side you have creators who shield games from criticism because now they have a working relationship with the publisher. It's funny that many of these more toxic fan bases that advocate for objective reviews rally towards figureheads who are so clearly compromised in their perspective. You have YouTubers and Twitch streamers angry about elements of video game development who, in amongst their theatrics, perhaps have some very valid points. But the barriers between audience and creator are so strongly established they'll rarely get a concrete, definitive answer to their questions. They might get a sanitized press release if the noise surrounding them is loud enough. But this just reinforces the narrative. Ill-informed question begets non-committal response. The lines are drawn, the cynicism and mistrust continues, and nothing gets resolved. But please, oh please don't forget to pre-order our upcoming Q3 title. And it comes full circle because the real answers they want are never there. Often because it's too complicated to thoroughly explain to those so far outside the industry, and answering one question is a spiral not just into more complicated matters, but exposing the complex informative process that the marketing has worked so hard to hide for the last 30 plus years. It's not worth it, because if they're more informed, then the next question might begin to tackle issues that the publisher doesn't want to address. And the worst examples of this are figureheads who build momentum for whatever cause they advertise, and then use it to promote their racist, sexist, homophobic or transphobic ideologies. It's how harassment campaigns such as Gamergate build momentum, because they point back to the ethics in game journalism argument, despite every single action taken that reinforces it's nothing but a hate campaign with an anti-progressive perspective on gaming's social identity and culture. The issues I'm bringing up in this video have been a problem for decades, and it's only steadily got worse as gaming culture on the internet has grown, and if anything, Gamergate was a warning of how mistrust can be sown and weaponised, first across the internet and then into the real world. And after the ramifications of this have been laid bare, and the impact of this approach has been made all too easy to see, there's still very little to show for serious attempts to address these issues. Gamergate might have simmered down, but it doesn't mean it ever really went away. And everything I've said up until now is summed up by the recent release of Cyberpunk 2077. It's the epitome of this systemic structural failing in communicating and discussing games, a publisher cultivating a beloved status among its fans, with pre-release marketing absolved of any and all criticism, even when rightfully deserved. Press are put under strict embargoes to not communicate the issues at release, and use specific B-roll footage in reviews. Meanwhile, the press are vilified such that any valid criticisms fall on deaf ears, or they receive backlash for something players themselves realise mere days later. The game was broken. It still is broken, and it should not have been released in that state. Rightfully, people are disappointed. They've been hoodwinked into buying the game, and subsequently, every corner of the industry suffers. None of this is whether Cyberpunk 2077 is any good. It's about the narrative that it's a game you need to buy, an environment in which the game is hyped to a point that many will buy it regardless for fear of missing out. An environment that works because the fans are kept in the dark, because being upfront and explaining what's happening fractures the carefully manufactured image. All the while, an ever-growing sect of the audience acts increasingly embittered and cynical, only to backpedal once the next project is announced, because their lack of understanding, combined with this inflated sense of purpose, makes them think that this time, it's all going to turn out better. The most depressing part of the Cyberpunk situation is that the game earned back its development costs already. CD Projekt are in the black. It proves that as long as you market your product such that the more avid fanbase embrace it and exploit the pressures placed on press and influencers, you can ship it broken and maybe fix it up later. These games are becoming too big to fail. Meanwhile, the brunt of the blowback will be thrown at developers, who have crunched on this project for a hell of a lot longer than the studio publicly acknowledged, and being forced to ship a game that is not reflective of their final aspirations. Games are never finished. They're abandoned. And while I was pondering writing this piece and slowly putting it together, CD Projekt issued an apology and a commitment to their fans that the quality of Cyberpunk will improve. The statement, presented by co-founder Marcin Nowinski, details the issues that led to the buggy launch of the console version of the game, the steps they are taking to correct it, and on behalf of the management of the studio, taking ownership for the mistakes made, even though immediately after he pretty much throws the QA team under the bus for the testing of the console ports. Sadly, it rings hollow, given this comes a month after the game had launched and the money is safely in their pockets. The video is built on the core conceit I mentioned earlier: making games is difficult, and it's as a result of these challenges that as the game moved towards shipping date, it became evident that there were significant issues with the console versions. I understand that, I respect that, but using that as a justification for their recommitment to the customers after the fact is disingenuous. If this had been the justification for delaying the game further, or delaying the console versions of the game, personally I would have lauded that decision, being upfront about the challenges of development, the realities of shipping games of this magnitude, and ultimately being straight with the gamers they so cherish. So what was this video about? It's a video about how the Cyberpunk situation is just the latest of a long list of high-profile blowouts driven by a system that keeps people buying games, even if the wider community poisons itself as a result. It's a story where capitalism and consumerism hurts the people who make the product and enjoy it. It's a story of people led by marketing to embrace products as a core part of their identity, of audiences holding everyone accountable except for those they should. It's a story of games hyped beyond their capabilities by those who don't even make them. It's a story of developers making good on promises made in bad faith, of fan bases weaponized to put down their money as soon as possible. A story of companies not taking responsibility for the toxic fans they nurture, of opportunists banging drums to pump their brand or sell their immoral views. And frankly, it's a story that's exhausting to watch, because it's not only one of our own making, it also has no perceivable end. I feel sorry for all the people who get caught up in these situations, despite their good intentions. The developers working away on a game that isn't ready, the marketing people braced for the blowback, journalists receiving all sorts of heinous responses because they're the first group of people who are honest with you and point out that maybe, just maybe, the game you've waited on for so long isn't all it's cracked up to be. All of this is not exclusive to games, of course, but frankly it's an issue that seems to be getting worse as every year passes. There's a lack of maturity in how this is managed and an expectation it will all go away, only for it to get worse with each iteration. While I started this video with the discussion of being more open to fans and rewarding their engagement by educating them more about the things they love, it's important to acknowledge that for some this idea is untenable. Not because it would expose how anarchic game development can be, which I don't have an issue with, I think this needs to be better communicated, but rather that it would expose many of the toxic personalities behind it. Bad actors in the industry rely on the obfuscation of their work, and how it shields them from reprisal, lest it is exposed by journalists who are paying attention. But as I close out this video, I am still hopeful. There are so many wonderful people out there working to make this a better industry, to help players, their families and aspiring developers better appreciate the medium, learning from players about the games they make and finding ways to have them be part of the process, sharing among their communities, helping them learn more, helping them understand more, and supporting them if they decide to join the industry itself. Sometimes those people support small but loved communities, or it's folks such as myself who have an audience of thousands, and those with even larger and broader impact on the industry. And however you're working to make this industry a better place for players or developers, I applaud you for those efforts, and I have no doubt that there are those out there who value your contributions and support. I'm a believer in the democratization of knowledge, to encourage others to learn more about the things that excite them and potentially influence them to find new passions based on that understanding. It's defined much of my adult life, first working as a university lecturer, and it's the driving force that led to the creation of what is now AI in games. But that said, tools that enable for mass spread of information need to be accurate, need to be credible, and built with the intent to support others. And that's the age we live in now, and as a result, there is plenty more work for us to be doing. Our work will never be finished, but hopefully, it'll never be abandoned either.